I mean, you know what? I've been looking at all the elections around the world, especially this year. I've been looking at the UK election, the European ones, the American one, and ours. And Byron, for some reason, I just think like sort of the long-term future of South Africa is more certain than a lot of these other European countries and America in particular. How are you feeling about that?
The reality is, Ramon, that I've lived abroad for 22 years, and so have you. Now, we've both had some experience of living abroad, and we both have an experience of living in South Africa. So when we talk, we're not talking out of our rear end, we're talking from experience. Now, when you look at a lot of the Western world, you have to notice that a lot of the Western world is in severe decline.
Yeah, so just a bit of a fact check. I have never lived abroad, but I've been abroad for extended periods of time. So I never sort of worked abroad. But I know quite well. I've traveled widely, been to many countries. And I fully agree with you in terms of that particular decline, especially Western Europe. Now, let's just look at Britain, a country that you love so much. That's why you came back. Britain has just had a sort of a landslide for Labour. Labour is essentially globalism Inc. We can expect many more immigrants, many more wokeness, a lot more DEI, all sorts of nefarious ways to surveil the population, all sorts of nefarious ways to take away property rights and freedom of association. To me, for all intents and purposes, Britain as a power is largely gone. And I don't see it coming back. And therefore, it's not a viable place for people to live in, especially for South Africans.
Yeah, so there's a common phrase, right? So if you actually work in finance or you work in politics, there's a common phrase that they often say, and that is policies of today are felt in 30 years from now. So you actually have to look at a lot of the policies that are in place in the United Kingdom. Well, a lot of them were introduced by Tony Blair. We're seeing a large amount of Blairism, right? So you got to think that Blair was in government for 12 years. Right after Blair, we had a Conservative government. The Conservative government did exactly what Conservative governments do. They conserve. But what did they conserve? Well, they conserved Blairism. In fact, David Cameron, the first Conservative Prime Minister who won from Gordon Brown, is famous to have said that in his opinion, he was the true successor of Blairism. So let's look at actually what Blairism basically says. Well, Blairism is for a lot of state central control. A lot of what we see in terms of the wokeness started in what we would typically refer to as the PC culture. Well, the PC culture started under Tony Blair. Mass immigration, as they currently have in the United Kingdom. Who started it? Tony Blair. Look at the population of London. You know, it's predominantly now foreign born. Sadiq Khan is known as the worst mayor ever seen in London, but he just won his election. Why? Because he's foreign born. He's a Pakistani prime minister. He's a Pakistani mayor of London who is predominantly a Muslim. So there's a lot of Muslims in London. Who did they vote for? They voted on ethnic lines. Who came up with this strategy and idea? Labour, Tony Blair. So to a large degree, what we are now seeing in terms of the decline in Britain really started with Tony Blair's government. We're seeing Blairism. And with Labour back in the driving seat, what you're now going to see is Blairism on steroids. This is why Jeremy Corbyn was so unpopular in the United Kingdom, because one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn was a Blairite. He didn't actually believe in it. He would have scrapped a lot of Blairist type policies, which is why obviously he had to go, right? And look at Liz Truss, also not a Blairite, so she had to go. Now, you may say all of this is hyperbolic, and we don't know what we're talking about. It's a very famous clip online. Do a little bit of research, you'll see it yourself. Keir Starmer was once asked if he had to choose between the United Kingdom and Davos, what is he going to choose? And he said Davos. He said because when he goes to Davos, it's like, you know, you have a bigger world out there and it's more interesting and blah, blah, blah. But his allegiance is to the global elite. His allegiance isn't to the people of the United Kingdom. So the global elites say have open borders. Guess what Keir Starmer is going to give them? If they say devalue your money, guess what Keir Starmer is going to give them? If they say introduce a wealth tax, guess what Keir Starmer is going to give them? And we're already starting to see the murmurs of all of that. And he's not even been in power for 24 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, I fully agree with all of that, and I think it's funny that Britain's going left while the rest of Europe apparently is going right. But Brexit was the right momentum, right? The momentous occasion for the right was Brexit, and the Tories completely screwed it up, and that's why they lost. If you look at France, my country, well, the country that I was born in, South Africa is my country. France also going right, apparently, but still, the right gets 30% of the vote. It's not that much. If you look at Bardella, the perhaps prime minister to be in a week or two, All they want to do is go back to the 1950s France with a welfare state for French people and lower immigration. Unfortunately, the entire system is set up in terms of you can't really have the welfare state of the 1950s without immigration. Because, I mean, people mechanized, people get older. There's a variety of reasons why you need immigration in to make France great again. Not that I'm a proponent of immigration at all, but that's what I'm seeing. So even if you get the right into power in Europe, you're just going to get a Giorgia Meloni situation where you got a so-called crypto fascist coming into power who has so remarkably neutered every single reactionary opinion that she's had in her 50 years of living. Why? Because she doesn't control her finances. Bond markets, she can't control the bond markets. She doesn't control the money supply. She doesn't control anything. The EU does. And the EU just says, you have to do this. Otherwise, Italy fails to exist as an economy. And that, if you take that approach to all of Europe, there's no way in hell Europe can correct itself. It is impossible.
No. And I would agree with that. And so what you commonly hear from a lot of individuals is, I'm going to Europe because it's going to be a better future for my kids. How? If you look at a lot of Europe is offshoring everything. Manufacturing, offshoring. Call centers, offshoring. Customer service, offshoring. Why? Because Europe as a whole financially is very, very expensive. And I mean very expensive. And a large amount of that is actually driven by the mass migration, right? I mean, there's this old thing called supply and demand. You know, maybe you've heard about it. It's only been around since like Adam Smith's day. But the idea behind supply and demand is that the more demand there is and the less supply it is, it drives up the cost. Well, there's only a finite amount of houses. They say to actually solve the housing crisis in the United Kingdom, they'd have to build one house every 2 minutes. It's not feasible. So as a result, the housing price has gone up in the United Kingdom because they literally cannot house the people that are there. Well, as you increase that, well, it increases other costs as well. Cars, petrol, even your groceries in the supermarket, because there's a finite amount of resources that can be sold to your population. So you see that the cost of living, just the cost of existing in Europe as a whole, is going up. But as they'll say, wages remain stagnant. Well, there's a reason for that, and that's because a lot of the companies don't want to pay large wages. Why? Well, because they can afford to pay lower wages to immigrants that are coming in. That's making it very unviable for a lot of individuals to sit there and live in those countries. So what do? They demand increased wages. Well, the companies then say, I can't afford it, and still make the same profit margins. So what's the logical step? Well, offshore it to a third world country where you can kind of get your resource or your product for cheaper. And that's exactly what you're seeing in Western Europe. So the grand irony is that whilst a lot of South Africans may say, I want to go to Western Europe because I've got more opportunities for my kids, Western Europe is saying there is no future here. We want to offshore our manufacturing and our customer service to the third world. So you want to go there for jobs, but they don't want to give jobs there. They want to give them here. It's the grand irony of everything.
It is quite ironic. So enough shitting on Europe. Let's focus on Canada, America, and let's just lump in Australia. Okay, Australia's sort of a bit different, but I mean, America going through the woke apocalypse. Maybe Trump will come back. Trump, what can he do in 4 or 5 years? I'm not too sure. I think in essence, the entire bureaucracy of America is woke and diverse and DEI, and it's just going to continue to do that for the next few decades. Canada's also gone as a nation. I mean, it's like half of New Delhi's there based on some student visa fraud. And also, no one can afford a house. I know many people who moved to Canada who are already struggling to make ends meet compared to when they were here. So also, I just don't think it's viable long term. And I'm not saying now. I'm not saying people shouldn't immigrate. I'm just saying, looking at this logically, South Africa just seems like a better option for more people than they might realize.
Yeah, so if you look at Canada as a whole, Canada is also having the same problems with the property markets as the United Kingdom and Western Europe. Everybody's having the same problems, mate. They're all having the same problems because of mass migration. And the only way that they can think to fix the economic problems that they find themselves in is more mass migration, which compounds the issue, right? It just makes it worse and worse and worse. And you're finding that right across the board. What's then happening is that the native borns are looking at their populations and going, this doesn't represent the country that I thought I used to live in. And the United Kingdom is a good example of that. Anybody who lives there, if you don't look around and notice the demographic change, then you just blind. It's obvious to anybody to see. You can also then correlate that directly with the cost of living. And again, if you can't associate the two, then there's something wrong with you. You're not noticing what's really going on. You're finding that same problem in the United Kingdom. You find it in Canada. You find it in America. It's all an issue of supply and demand. And as the third world goes to those countries and the countries can't sustain the third world in them, lo and behold, what happens to those countries? Well, they become the third world, right? I mean, people start resorting to what they know. If they came from a country where maybe they had to steal to survive, guess what they're going to do in the new country? Steal to survive. Yeah. Look at crime rates then in all of the cities where they all go to. They're off the charts. London is a great example of this. It's worse than it's ever been. And guess what? And they're all machetes, people doing machete attacks and knife attacks, which are not common type of attacks to the native-born British. But I know where machete attacks are common to, and it's not Britain.
Indeed. And for Australia, I mean, try find a house under like $2 million. It's basically impossible anywhere on the West Coast. So essentially, what are we trying to say here? So here's my sort of conclusion to this. We've highlighted all the issues of the rest of the world. Every day we highlight issues in South Africa, so don't make it look like we don't have any issues whatsoever. But here's the one thing about South Africa that's really interesting with regards to it, as opposed to being another African country. The Government of National Unity is a huge thing, right? People try to underplay it. People try to downplay it. That's a massive thing where Liberation Party has given up power with its opposition to bring them into the fore. We'll see how it goes. It's not utopia, but it exists, and that is something we need to be sort of proud and thankful for. Number 2, prices are still fine. Number 3, the issues that are hurting us as people of South Africa and South Africa as a nation are crime and racial discrimination at a sort of national level. Those two things are very easy to solve. El Salvador has shown us what to do with crime. Singapore has shown us what to do with racial, nationalism at a national level. Once we get someone who has the power to do that, this country can only soar. And I think the chances of that happening are relatively higher than in most places around the world.
Yes, I mean, you've got to also remind yourself of one fundamental fact, and it's a fact that you and I, Ramon, have spoken about many times, and that is that the property in South Africa is greatly undervalued. If you look at the rest of the world, it's like drastically different to here. Go look at even property in Zimbabwe. It's like 4 times the price of South Africa. Property in South Africa is greatly undervalued, and a lot of it is because analysts on other platforms like to shit on the country, right? You'll find Facebook platforms, you'll find all sorts of articles in News 24 and Business Tech, and they're all telling you how, you can earn lots of money by moving to New Zealand or Australia or America or insert some country here, right? And the interesting thing is that those articles are always sponsored articles by people who specialize in, well, would you know it, immigration. It's also interesting that they're always the same countries. I mean, it's technically speaking, there's a YouTube channel online, right? And it's called Nomad Capitalist. And Nomad Capitalist always says, if you want to go to a country where your money goes the furthest and you have the best quality of life, go to Malaysia. So I got to ask you a simple question. How come Malaysia never features in all the people's ideas of, I want to move abroad for a better life? How come it's always England, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, who happen to be the only countries who say they need diversity in order to prop up their economies? And that's because there's a massive, huge economic, let's call it war, propaganda campaign against the local population in order to try to steal them to these countries. They want to basically bring these countries abroad as if you're almost exporting coal. You're just a resource to them, nothing more. But in the process, what they've done is they've almost discouraged the individual's kind of belief. They've taken away the degree of nationalism. They've taken away a degree of belief in the country itself. I know you like him, but I don't. And that's Haystack. Haystack goes on quite a lot. And he's constantly talking about how property and finances in South Africa are terrible and you should move it abroad. And then, wait, where does he live? Oh, yeah, Mauritius. What does he specialize in? Taking money out of the country. So I know you like him. I really don't, because I can see what he's doing. He's allowing people to get inundated by the fear of the country itself, and as a result, using that fear in order to economically benefit. I use it as my business, right? And as a result, what that's done is it's driven the property price down. It's driven people's faith in property. It's driven people's faith in investment in South Africa. And it's not just him. It's a wider issue. But the net result of that is, regardless of who you are, if you look at property in South Africa, it's greatly undervalued. You can buy a mansion in South Africa for the equivalent of £80,000. In the UK, you know what you can get for £80,000? A car park. That's probably it. You can park your car in it, if you're lucky. And I mean one car, not a double car park. I mean one car. That's what it will cost you.
Yeah. And on top of all that, if you want to go off grid, you can. You don't need a license or anything like that. Do you want to renovate your house? You can. You don't need permission. You want to do whatever you want. Get a firearm. Get a firearm. You can in South Africa. This is a libertarian paradise because the government is largely retarded. Never forget that. It is much better to live under dictatorship of the retarded than an efficient liberal order like the rest of these countries. And as long as that remains, so will I, right here in South Africa.